one word.
Was this mistake made in Transportation Committee or in the Judiciary Committee or somewhere else?
Pretty sure it's judiciary.
I might have been here then too. It's Ashford. All right, I don't see any questions, Senator Friesen. I assume you'll wave close. All right, have a great afternoon and a good weekend. We will take proponent testimony at this time.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop and members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Elaine Menzel. It's ELAINE-MENZEL. Here on behalf of the Nebraska Association of County Officials, as Senator Friesen indicated, and we do appreciate his assistance in bringing this legislation to your committee. We presumed perhaps that it would go to transportation, but here we are. We would just ask you to please advance this to general file. This is essentially related to when the legislature was transferring functions from the clerk to the treasurer. So it's now what we call one stop. So if you have any questions, I would gladly attempt to answer them.
I don't see any questions. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Any other proponent testimony? Anyone here in opposition? Anyone here to speak in a neutral capacity? Seeing none, Senator Friesen is waved closing. I just want to make sure we don't have any position letters. If you have them, they're up front. Oh. No position letters have been received on LB 748. That'll close our hearing on LB 748 and bring us to our second bill of this Friday afternoon, LB 878, and Senator John Kavanaugh, who is on his way.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're up. Welcome, Senator Kavanaugh, to your Friday afternoon version of the Judiciary Committee.
It's my favorite time. Good afternoon.
That's the day we ask the fewest questions.
We'll see. Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is John Kavanaugh, JOHNCAVANAUGH, and I represent the 9th Legislative District in Midtown Omaha. I'm here today to introduce LB 878, which provides automatic bail review after 14 days for misdemeanor and city ordinance violations. Article 1, Section 9 of the Nebraska Constitution says, all persons shall be bailable by sufficient sureties, then lists exceptions. The question is, what is bailable? If the court sets a dollar amount and the individual cannot post that amount, are they bailable? LB 878 says that when a court sets conditions of bail for defendants on low-level offenses and that person is unable to meet those conditions within 2 weeks, then the court has to hold a hearing and determine if those same conditions should still apply, and in light of the fact the defendant could not post bail, whether the person is still considered bailable. LB 878 would make review of a defendant's bail conditions for misdemeanor offenses routine rather than something extraordinary. It does not in any way eliminate a judge's ability to impose the same conditions, but makes the process of getting in front of a judge automatic. Consider what would happen if you did not show up to work for 2 consecutive weeks. You would likely lose your job, and that is the results in a system in which pretrial release is primarily based on the defendant's ability to pay cash bond. In my experience, I've seen people lose their job, their house, their doctor's appointments, and the progress that they've made in getting their life back together when they are detained for even a few days. I understand the concerns that this will put greater strain on the courts, but in the fiscal note, Lancaster County estimates that they would average about 5 hearings a day. I want to thank the committee for your time and ask you to advance LB 878, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I appreciate you bringing the bill here, and I understand why you are. If someone has their bail set, they don't meet it, they come back 14 days later, and the judge says, well, I had it set at 500, I'll make it 250, and they can't meet it, when do they next come before the judge? Every day until they get it to a number they like, or every 14 days, what would be the?
Right. The intention of the statute, whether I'd have to confirm whether that would actually be effective, but the intention and I think as it's written would be every 14 days.
Okay.
And to be clear, most a county court case is going to come to trial shortly after that second 14 days, probably sometime around 30 days.
Okay. And the reality is most of the people who would fall into this category probably aren't going to get 14 days in jail for whatever they did.
Most are not, yeah.
Okay. Any questions for Senator Kavanaugh? I see none. Are you going to stay to close?
I will stick around.
Okay,
Unless they
very
call
good.
me to another hearing.
Any proponents of LB 878? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop and members of the Judiciary Committee. Again, my name is Elaine Menzel, ELAINE-MENZEL, here today on behalf of the Nebraska Association of County Officials. We appreciate Senator Kavanaugh for bringing this to your attention. Unfortunately, did not have the opportunity to speak to him beforehand, and I do have a suggestion that we would ask you to potentially consider amending, and perhaps that will take care of some of the transportation concerns that were expressed within the fiscal note from Lancaster County. But that would be that these reviews could be potentially heard via audio-visual means, and we'd be glad to work with the senator to hopefully address that issue. The reason we are supportive of this, when our legislative committee considered it, they ultimately thought that perhaps the reviews would allow the inmates to be released at a sooner time frame. So with that, I'm available for any questions if you happen to have those at this time.
So you're a proponent of the bill, but you'd like to see it done by video conferencing?
Permissible, yes.
Okay. I think I understand your position. I don't see any other questions. Thank you for being
Thank you,
here.
Senator.
Next proponent.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Spike Eicholt, S-P-I-K-E-E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T, appearing on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska and the Nebraska Criminal Defense Attorneys Association. Hopefully it's okay if I testify at the same time. Our positions are consistent. We do support this bill. I'm not going to be duplicative, at least I hope not, in my testimony, but as Senator John Kavanaugh explained and as Ms. Menzel testified to, this will hopefully accelerate the release of people whose bonds are set initially too high. That can happen in a couple of situations. Even though I think last session, the legislature tried to limit the judge's ability. In a criminal case, you have a right to have an attorney appointed in any kind of case if you're looking at a jail sentence. What would happen, at least, and still continues to happen sometimes, is the judge would determine from the prosecutor saying they're not going to seek jail, not appoint a lawyer, but sometimes the judges would still set a money bond that the person could not post. And what would happen, you'd have somebody who couldn't post that money bond be sitting in jail without counsel. In Lancaster County, they can send what they call a kite, an informal request to the jail administration saying, I'd like to have a bond review. I want to be able to go back in front of the judge and talk about my bond, because the law already allows somebody after 24 hours to request a review of their bond. But if you don't have a lawyer and you're sitting there and you don't have the ability or the smarts, if you will, to bootstrap that claim yourself, you're going to sit there indefinitely. And we heard testimony from earlier bills about people sitting in jail for weeks and then finally going to court on a trial date and just pleading or working on a deal and getting a very minimal sentence, which is probably why I'm going to speculate NACO may be in support of that concept, because there are people sitting in jail perhaps longer than necessary. It would also target those people who, when they first appear in front of a judge, they say, "Judge, I think I'm going to hire a lawyer. Don't give me one yet." Because they're optimistic the family's going to help them out. And when they get back in jail, they realize the family's not going to help them out. So they're sitting in jail without a lawyer. This at least has an automatic opportunity for them to be in front of the judge. With respect to the concern that NACO had about video conferencing as an option, I would respectfully suggest you don't need to do anything to the statute about that. Section 24-704 is a general court jurisdiction that allows for telephonic, virtual type hearings and other kind of things besides in any kind of case, either by arrangement and agreement of the parties or at the discretion of the judge. I will tell you that in Lancaster County, and I know in Douglas County, a lot of these types of hearings are done video conferencing. You could, as a litigant, you could insist on your client being transported, but as a practical matter, you're not going to because it's just an inconvenience, and the judges generally would prefer to do something like this virtually. So with that, I would encourage the committee to advance the bill.
So does the fiscal note suggest that that's an expense that'll happen on account of the bill, and you're saying that's not accurate?
I think if you look at the fiscal note from Lancaster County, they kind of qualify it. They have a number amount that's assumed on transporting people for every 14-day hearing, and then they explain that if it could be done virtually, it would be significantly less. That may have to have more staff time to move inmates within the jail from their little, their barracks, if you will, their units to the Zoom room, so to speak. I'll tell you in Lancaster County, every 10 o'clock, every 9:30 and 10 o'clock and 1:30 sessions, they have Zoom because they have jail out there in West Elm. So they typically have people sort of cycle through the room. And that's generally when you do the bond reviews at that time too. I suppose they looked at the four corners of the document. I mean, this is the current law, the bond review process, and these are done virtually now. So adding the every 14-day requirement does not, at least the way I look at it, does not require it to be done live.
Well, when it says shall be brought before the judge, do we need to change that to shall be presented to the court?
Or appear before the court, or appear.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be in person. Is that, as a practical matter, if I've been in there on a misdemeanor for 14 days, that's probably more time than most misdemeanors are gonna get, right? So isn't that an opportunity for them to talk to the judge and get the whole thing disposed of?
Sometimes. I mean, if it's a serious misdemeanor, like a misdemeanor domestic assault, a misdemeanor concealed weapon type charge, something like that, that's your top level, you might be there for more than 14 days.
Okay.
The domestic cases, in my opinion, are probably going to be the ones going to get you there on a high bond for a lengthy period of time. But if it's any kind of city ordinance, trespass, disturbing the peace, failure to appear on a misdemeanor fine, you're not going to be there for that length of time, in my opinion.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Eichel? Seeing none, thanks for being
Thank
here.
you. And just, I'm sorry, the shall be brought before the judge, that phraseology is already used in the current statute. So that's maybe why that was copied on pages 13 and 14, or
Okay.
lines 13 and 14.
Okay, very well. Thank you for your testimony. Anyone else here in support of LB 878? Welcome back.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Jasmine Harris, JASMINEHARRIS. I am the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy with RISE. We are the largest nonprofit organization in Nebraska working on reentry efforts here. And I'll skip all that entry, as you all know that. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, Nebraska's incarceration rate is 577 per 100,000 people, which includes prisons, jails, immigration detention, and youth facilities. This rate is higher than the countries like UK, Canada, and Italy. The average daily jail population statewide is 3,489 people. And although that number sounds low, we must consider the transient population that is going in and out of our jails. So the annual unique jail admissions is about 30,000, with over 70,000 people being released each year. We continue to ask for alternatives to help alleviate overcrowding As we see, our county jails are dealing with this as well, and the solution must be a proactive approach. At RISE, we believe that alleviation can happen on the front end by addressing county jails and the pretrial system. As of RISE's policy and advocacy work, we are interested in identifying and addressing gaps and opportunities related to the pretrial justice system in Nebraska. We conducted an assessment on the pretrial system by way of survey in September of 2020. One of the questions we asked received a 78% response that people disagreed with the statement that no one is detained due to the inability to pay a financial condition for release. According to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System's Economic Well-Being of U.S. Households in 2020, they reported that 35% of adults faced with an unexpected $400 expense would have difficulty completely covering that expense. We have people currently sitting in our Nebraska jails with a $5,000 bond, meaning they need $500 for release and cannot afford it. This continues to perpetuate cycles of poverty and incarceration. It results in people who do not have disposable income spending days to months in jail that further impacts their livelihood. It takes on average about 3 days before someone who is in jail cannot afford or who cannot afford their cash bail to potentially lose their employment, housing, and custody to their children. LB 878 would ensure that individuals who are languishing in jail have a process in place to automatically review their circumstances to identify the reasons why they're not able to meet those conditions. According to a Columbia Law Review article, best practice would be to have these reviews in a shorter period of time, preferably within a maximum of 48 hours. We don't have a process in place, so this 14-day review would be a step in the right direction. So with our vision that all people will find freedom from cycles of incarceration, we support LB 878 and ask that you all advance it out of Committee to General File.
Very well. I don't see any questions for you. Thank you for being here today. Next proponent. Anyone here in opposition to LB 878? Anyone here in the neutral capacity? Seeing none, Senator Kavanaugh, you may close. We do have one position letter, and that is in opposition from the County Attorneys Association.
Shot. Thank you, Chairman Lathrop. Just to kind of clarify, I know Mr. Eichholt gave some perspective on how Lancaster County does it. In Douglas County, they have been doing these remote bail setting hearings basically since COVID started. It is permissive, although certainly we try to work with people to make sure that this is actually implementable. I appreciate Ms. Harris's putting some context to it, but what happens, in Douglas County, which is what I practice and what I'm familiar with, people come through county court and get appointed a lawyer, but their bond gets set without a lawyer being present. And then you have the opportunity to request a hearing to come in front of a judge and review that bond. That is often very perfunctory, even though you now have a lawyer, because the judge says, well, no circumstances have changed. One of the intentions of this bill is to say, in these situations where people are not bailing out, that is essentially a change in circumstances after 14 days. We are saying it's a presumption that they're not able to post that bond, and that is a condition that needs to be considered under the Constitution and under the statute. And so it's to make sure that people get a fair hearing on these bonds. The 14-day limit, I spoke with some prosecutors in Douglas County, though I know the county attorneys are against it. And that was a number that settled on that date because it was far enough out that it wasn't going to be happening all the time and become so administratively burdensome, but soon enough that it would still actually catch people who are awaiting their trial. It's essentially the halfway point between a misdemeanor trial, with the exception of a Class 1 misdemeanor in Douglas County, between when you come into the courthouse and your misdemeanor trial. So it's just another opportunity to make sure that we are actually meeting our burden to the people that we're detaining pre-trial. And that I take.
So they still retain the right to request one within 24 hours.
Right, and every 24 hours.
But this would just be automatically, you're going to bring them in front of the judge after 14 days.
Which has, in my experience, the request for a bond review can often be perceived as acrimonious, or can start out on a contentious footing from the judge when a defendant asks for a bond review. So this is to take it out of the hands of the defendant even and put it on the state.
Okay. Great. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
That'll close our hearing. I don't see any questions. That'll close our hearing on 8/7. Okay. Great. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
That'll close our hearing. I don't see any questions. That'll close our hearing on 8/78. Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Have a great weekend. And bring us to LB 808 and Senator Moorfield. Good afternoon, Senator Moorfield.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Adam Moorfeld, ADAM, MOR, F as in Frank, ELD, here today to introduce LB 808, a bill that updates the Nebraska Uniform Controlled Substances Act to conform with the State Controlled Substances Act schedule to the Federal Controlled Substance Act schedule. That's a mouthful. And as you'll see that a lot of the terms in the legislation are also a mouthful. But in any case, the following is a general description of each schedule contained within the Federal Controlled Substances Act. I just want to get a few things in the record, but it won't take long here. Schedule 1's controlled substances. Substances in this schedule have no current accepted use in the United States, a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision, and a high potential for abuse. Schedule 2 controlled substances. Substances in this schedule have a high potential for abuse, which may lead to severe psychological or physical dependence. Schedule 3's controlled substances. Some substances in this schedule have a lesser potential than 1 or 2 for abuse, but may lead to moderate or low physical dependence or high psychological dependence. Then we have Schedule 4 and Schedule 5 substances as well. I'm going to skip a little bit to some of the changes here. LB 808 makes the following updates to the schedule. For Schedule 1, new items lines 74 to 94 are synthetic fentanyl, none of which are FDA approved and commonly referred to as street drugs. New item 5 is a stimulant and hallucinogen that's commonly referred to as a street drug. And then there's a third item is page 16, which is an amphetamine. And then there's a new item, number 9, is a psychostimulant and street designer drug. And then on Schedule 2, item 13 is currently used in clandestine laboratory operators to create fentanyl. And then on Schedule 4, the FDA-approved drugs, new item numbered 60 is used for treatment of ADHD and is similar to the FDA-approved Ritalin that many of us know about. As some of you may or may not know, we do this every 2 years to update these because as these designer drugs come out, it's hard to be able to go after some of the folks that produce them in many cases. And they're fairly dangerous to the public. I thank you for your favorable consideration of LB 808. There'll be somebody from the Nebraska Pharmacy Association here today to answer any of your questions, but I'm happy to answer any that I may try. Thank you.
Okay, this literally is a routine that we go through
Every 2 years.
Okay.
I
I'm
picked the
familiar with it.
short straw this year, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Senator Moorfield. I don't
Thank you.
see any questions. We will take proponent testimony on LB 808. Good afternoon, welcome.
Good afternoon, Senator Lathrop, members of the committee. My name is Marcia Muting. It's MARCIA MUETING. I am a pharmacist, and I am the CEO of the Nebraska Pharmacists Association and a registered lobbyist. And I'm here to talk to you in support of LB 808. As Senator Moorfelt, thank you for introducing this bill, mentioned, this bill will update our Nebraska controlled substance schedules to mirror those of the federal law. There is one FDA-approved medication, as Senator Moorfelt noted. The rest of the medications that are listed are considered street drugs. Senator Moorfelt's opening comments included the details that's in my written testimony as far as what pages and which drugs are being updated. And I'm here to answer any questions if there are.
Are you done? Okay. Hey, I have a question for you. Is there a simple way to describe fentanyl?
It's a synthetic opioid So it's always made in a lab. There's no natural source. Morphine comes from poppy seeds, right? Opium. Fentanyl is made in a lab.
Are there other things that would fall within that description, or would that just be fentanyl? I'm asking for another bill, actually.
Oh, okay, asking for a friend.
If we're going to exclude, fentanyl, that street drug that is so dangerous, how would one describe that accurately?
Well, the fentanyl type substances that are listed in this bill are illegal substances. Fentanyl itself is a legal substance and is found in FDA approved medications. And those are in class 2, schedule 2.
Okay,
So we have good fentanyl and we have bad fentanyl, I guess.
okay. So to describe it, we could just refer to this page, I suppose.
Or, exclude FDA approved products that have fentanyl in them.
Okay,
Does
But-
that make sense?
it does to me if you tell me that's how we can describe it.
I'm a pharmacist, not an attorney, but
Okay.
I
Well,
think
I'm an
that's what we've
attorney and
done.
not a pharmacist, which is why I'm asking.
any other questions?
Okay, I appreciate you,
Of course.
trying to answer my questions as inartfully as I might have presented them. And I don't see any other questions, but thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, have a good weekend.
Thank you, you too.
Next proponent. Just have to refer to that page.
Chairman Lathrop, Senators of the Judiciary Committee, good afternoon. My name is Jim McGuire, Jimmaguire. I'm president of the Nebraska Fraternal Order of Police. We're here supporting this bill. And we just essentially just want to be on record saying that we're supporting it. Thank you very much.
Short and simple for a Friday. Thanks, and you barely made it in time. Thanks, Mr. McGuire. We appreciate your testimony and you coming down here to put it on the record. Any other proponents of LB 808? Seeing none, is anyone here in opposition? Anyone here in a neutral capacity? Seeing none. Senator Moorfield, do you wish to close? He waives closing. We do have one proponent, position letter for the record, which will be made part of the record. And that will close our hearing on LB 808. And bring us to Senator McKinney and LB 816. Good afternoon, Senator McKinney.
Good afternoon, Chair Lathrop and members of the Judiciary Committee. Today, we're here to discuss LB 816, which would require collection of data upon commitment to the Department of Correctional Services. Under this bill, the department would be required to include an incarcerated individual's last known address as well as the legislative district at the time of admission in the inmate's individual file. I brought this bill because, as you all know, 95% of the individuals currently incarcerated have an anticipated release date, and it behooves us as their elected representatives to ensure that that release date is their last. This bill acknowledges that reducing recidivism and reducing the number of individuals entering the criminal justice system is paramount to the progress of our state. Additionally, ensuring each legislative district has an accurate percentage of individuals incarcerated who are from their district will go a long way in equipping senators to be able to address this issue. A way to meet this goal is to track each incarcerated individual's pre-incarceration address and note the legislative district in which it sits. This will ultimately help senators representing various districts work to reduce constituents who enter the criminal justice system, as well as offer proper services within their districts to reduce recidivism. What we should also note is that by not properly tracking addresses of incarcerated individuals, we undermine our democracy in several significant ways. One, by not having this information, we present a warped snapshot of the general population and misrepresent incarcerated people's relationship to their representatives. 2, Black and Latino communities are deprived of representation since they make up a large part of the Nebraska prison population. This also hinders the districts that they are rightfully from receiving accurate population counts for census purposes. 3, as a result of the foregoing, communities that have larger white populations and lower incarceration rates end up receiving a representation windfall in comparison to the other districts merely because of a lack of the data. These factors end up serving as a catalyst that compounds other forms of discrimination. Generally, the Census Bureau generally deems people's home where they live and sleep most of the time. For people in prison, this means the site of their incarceration rather than their home communities, even though in most cases they have no meaningful connection to that area. The policy wrongfully suggests that people in prison are at home where they're incarcerated. It ignores that most people's stay in prison is far shorter than the decade for which the maps will be in effect with the census, and that many states consider incarcerated people's legally residents in their home communities for purposes other than redistricting. The impact is that this would be true for time even after the release. In closing, by providing accurate residency data for incarcerated individuals, the senators of this body can respond effectively to policymaking decisions and services for our districts to reduce harm that our high incarceration rates have on our state. I ask for your support of LB 816, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Senator
I
Geis.
do have a quick question. I noticed not only in the fiscal note, but also in a response letter from the director that they can ask for this, but that the accuracy can't be determined by what is given. Is that of any concern to you?
No, because we put in here last known address. Like, so for example, say someone commits an offense and the county or the police put out a warrant. They'll go search the last known address.
Okay.
Most people, I won't say all, but majority of people have a last known address or some type of identification that says where they were living prior to incarceration.
Okay.
So I'm not really hung up on the accuracy because
Okay.
I think, as long as we track last known address, that's fair.
All right.
No
Thank you.
problem.
Okay, well, apparently it costs $81,000 to ask people what their last known address is.
I mean, their budget gets, increased pretty much every year. And currently we have federal funds that you could use for crime intervention. So the money is there to pay.
I know the FOP got a raise, Senator McKinney, but
Yeah.
that seems like pretty high compensation. to
Yeah,
ask
and
a bunch of guys where they last lived.
And last I known, I think I saw some in the newspaper, and I've heard recently that they've been getting a bunch of applicants since they put out the new raises. So I hope if they're getting as much applicants as they're saying, staffing shouldn't be an issue either.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate you bringing the bill to the committee. I understand the purpose. We talked about that during redistricting. So
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing the bill. I don't see any questions. We'll take proponent testimony at this time.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Spike Eichel, S-P-I-K-E. Last name is E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T, appearing on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska as their registered lobbyist in support of LB 816. We want to thank Senator McKinney for introducing this bill. This bill addresses something that Senator McKinney alluded to, and that is this concept of what's called prison gerrymandering. And that is the Census Bureau will generally include people and sort of locate where they live, where they are sort of live and spend most of their time. And for people who are in prison, the sort of the default location that the Census Bureau considers those people is where they are housed in a prison. And what happens is, and you can kind of see this for this last redistricting that we had in this state, is that if you have 1,500 people in a prison in a certain district, or if you have 12 or 1,300 people in a prison in a county that's relatively small, that can have an impact, if you will, when you count the total residents of the county. Even though, as Senator McKinney indicated, every 10 years, the states redistrict, the average stay for people in prison in this state is about 30 months. So you've got people sort of coming in and out, and it's not necessarily accurate, we would submit, label to call those people residents of that county for purposes of the census. And Senator McKinney actually introduced a bill during the special session for redistricting to sort of address this issue or delineate those numbers. And at the time, I can't remember if Senator McKinney withdrew it or just asked the committee to hold it, the special committee, because at the time it was learned the Department of Corrections didn't have an accurate way to really identify the home districts from the people who were in prison. And so what this bill does, I suspect, is try to address that issue so that perhaps next time when we're redistricting, we can get an accurate count on this, in addition to the other reasons that Senator McKinney has introduced the bill. I did distribute a chart that I left upstairs that was brought down for me earlier, and that is like a breakdown of what other states have done with respect to this. And a growing number of states are trying to address this issue, and we're going to encourage the committee to advance this, if anything, to accurately track, aside from the redistricting issue, but at least accurately track where people are coming from who end up in our prison system.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Eichel? I'm just going to ask this question on page 2, where it says, including his or her last known address. So do we need to clarify that as a residential address, or what if they say the Department of Corrections in Douglas County?
Yeah, that might want to identify that. I think that may want to be clarified. I would just say that.
But because before somebody ends up at the Department of Corrections, their last stop might have been Douglas County Jail, a homeless shelter, the Mission, a home.
That's right.
And the point is try to find out what legislative or congressional district they might have been in.
That's right.
I don't know if that needs to be clarified in some respect, or whether the last known address does it.
It might need to be clarified. If I could just suggest is that most people end up in prison, probably almost all of them have had a pre-sentence investigation report done. And that's pretty comprehensive. That's a report the probation office does. They do it for every felony case. It collects a lot of biographical information about the defendant, information related to the case, juvenile history, everything. It's actually presumed confidential, but the department has an opportunity to review, I think, most of that for purposes of classification. So if somebody's had a mental health history, when they're doing that 30 to 90-day evaluation at D&E, they have access to that. Perhaps somehow allowing access to that might identify accurately where they're from and where they're likely to go back to, as opposed to, like you say, they're dropped off with 15 other inmates from Douglas County Jail.
So, not to belabor this point, but their jacket or their file doesn't actually get to D&E the same time the person does it?
That's right.
It takes a few days.
Generally, yes.
Would it make more sense to say the department shall secure from the pre-sentence investigation or documents accompanying the prisoner a last known address?
Yeah, that would be good. That'd be helpful.
Then we may not need a whole full-time FOP employee to secure this information. Thank you. You've helped answer my question. Any other proponent testimony?
Senator Lathrop, members of the committee, my name is Gavin Geis, that is spelled Gavin-Geis, and I'm the Executive Director for Common Cause Nebraska. We are here in support of LB 816. We believe it supports and furthers the goal of a fair, more representative redistricting process. At the end of the day, we think that's what this bill comes down to and would help us the most is just creating a better redistricting process 10 years from now. As was mentioned, since 1790, the census has counted prisoners as residents of where they're incarcerated. What we've learned in the 200 years since then is that this Nebraskans residing in districts without prisons. In effect, their votes carry more weight. This is possible because many incarcerated individuals are unable to vote. yet they're treated the same as eligible voters when it comes to the process of redistricting. And this is made all the worse by the fact that minority communities are overrepresented in our prison system. This effectively shifts political power from those communities to the districts containing prisons. We support LB 816 because it would start the process, at least, of collecting the data we need to properly distribute prison populations into their home communities during the redistricting process. It's important that we take this issue seriously and that we take action today if we want to protect the right of one person, one vote for every Nebraskan, not just for those incarcerated or those in minority communities, but every Nebraskan is affected by this process when your neighbors have greater political power simply because they live in a district that contains a prison. That is a distortion of the voting systems, and we think that 816 should be advanced. We encourage you to do so. It will help us make redistricting just fairer and more representative. Thank you.
Okay. Appreciate you being here.
Appreciate it.
Any other proponent testimony? Anyone here in opposition to LB 816 or in the neutral capacity? Seeing none. Senator McKinney, you may close.
Thank you, everyone that, spoke up and for the conversation on this bill. I think it's really important to make sure that all Nebraskans get proper representation, no matter what, no matter if you're incarcerated or not. I think we need to make sure that we ensure that everyone is represented properly. To your question, Senator Lathrop, I'm open to adding residential address, or even if it's just a simple fix to saying the department shall secure from the pre-sentence investigation to probably eliminate the $80,000 fiscal note. So I'm open to that as well.
Okay, anything we can do to knock that down?
Right.
Okay. $61,000 for somebody to collect that information seems a little high. Thank you. I don't see any questions, Senator McKinney. We do have three position letters for the record. Three are proponents and one is neutral. And that neutral came from Director Frakes himself. That will close our hearing on 816. Thank you, Senator McKinney. And bring us to our own Senator Geist and LB 1010. Good afternoon, Senator Geist.
Well, good afternoon. It's still bright and early. This is
Hey,
awesome.
we don't have time for these pleasantries.
Speed it up. It's Friday.
No,
Okay.
Welcome to the judiciary.
Thank you, Chairman Lathrop, and good afternoon, members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Suzanne Geist. That's SUZANNEGEIST. I represent District 25, which consists of the southeast part of Lincoln and Lancaster County. This past fall, I held a roundtable with many juvenile justice stakeholders in the state. During this roundtable, it was mentioned that there was a reinterpretation of the law regarding adult and juvenile offenders on probation. So I introduced LB 1010 to clarify in statute that it's okay for law enforcement to have access to information regarding why an offender may be on parole or probation. This information would be kept in the Nebraska Criminal Justice Information Service. This information is important for the safety of law enforcement and the public. Another benefit of this information in CJIS is that law enforcement would be able to provide the probation or parole officer of any violation and assist in getting the offender back into compliance. LB 1010 also provides access for the law enforcement to see the GPS history of a youth offender's electronic monitoring device. Electronic monitoring devices are an alternative to placing a youth offender in detention. This information allows law enforcement to know the whereabouts of the youth being monitored. The law enforcement professional is obligated to keep the information confidential. I do have an amendment for this bill. It's mostly cleanup language, And the last change on page 12 is to strike the probation reference and insert parole. This statute is specifically for parole and should not reference probation. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
So walk me through that change you just described. On
Okay.
page 12, Senator Geist, there is on lines 4 through 7, changes to existing law. What,
And what it will do is strike the occurrences of probation and insert parole on line 7 on page 12. There are two here.
okay, no, I think I
See
see it.
that?
There's 2 references on line 7. and
Yeah.
Instead of saying conditions of, or instead of saying probation officer, it would
It
say
should say
parole
parole
officer. Instead
officer.
of saying conditions of probation, it would say
Correct.
conditions of parole.
Correct.
Okay. Any other questions for Senator Geist? Senator McKinney?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Geist. What do you say to the opposition that says this information is already available to law enforcement for probable cause and a warrant?
It is available if they go, okay, it used to be available. And then there was a reinterpretation of the statute. There was not a statutory change. It was just reinterpreted by, I believe by the Supreme Court administrators, that they could no longer use it. And so in our roundtable, there was discussion of why it was no longer used. And it was because there was a reinterpretation, and they suggested we clarify it in statute in order for them to use it the way they used to. So it's not necessarily that anything has changed other than the interpretation of the statute. Does that make sense? Does that
Yes.
answer your question?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Oh, Senator DeVore.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a related but perhaps not identical question.
Okay.
What is the protocol right now with respect to if law enforcement wants to know about offenders' probation status and conditions of status and all of that?
They actually have to get a warrant for that information. I believe that's the case. Why don't you ask that
All right,
question
I'll do
to the
that.
people
I'll do that.
behind me?
Yep. I'll ask the next person.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other questions.
Great.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you.
We will take proponent testimony at this time.
Bear with me, I was notified a couple days ago to do this. This is my first time here. So
Oh, hey, listen, we don't try to hassle people when they testify, so you're going to be fine. Welcome.
thank you for having me. Good afternoon, Senators. My name is Tyler Stricker. That's Stricker. I am here on behalf of the Omaha Police Department in favor of LB 1010. I've worked for the Omaha Police Department for just under 17 years. The majority of my career has been dedicated to working in different investigative units, both as a detective and as a sergeant. I'm currently assigned as a sergeant on one of our afternoon gang suppression unit crews. We believe this bill will simply return us back to previous practice. There are 2 important revisions in this bill, and I'd like to address each one of those revisions individually. First, the release of certain probation information. In the past, probation officers or POs, name and contact information, probationer's name, and some of the conditions of their probation were readily available on the Nebraska Criminal Justice Information System, also known as NCJIS. Around late 2020, this information was abruptly, without notice, removed from NCJIS. This is what we believe to be also an officer safety concern. Without this information quickly and readily available as it used to be on NCJIS, officers will be contacting individuals who may be on terms of probation for crimes of violence or weapons charges and not know it. Furthermore, there are probationers that judges have specifically ordered to have law enforcement search clauses. We are blind to this information. Second is a revision to provide a probationer's electronic monitoring data to law enforcement immediately upon request. Again, this change was abrupt and to my knowledge started around the end of 2019, specifically with juvenile probation. Initially, we were advised by juvenile probation that we have to seek a warrant for this information to be released, and to my understanding, it is now a court order. Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court recently ruled on this topic in Commonwealth versus Johnson, which I can summarize if requested, and Nebraska would not be the only statute to have this type of language in a statute. So why would this information be beneficial to law enforcement? Most often during an investigation, we are interested whether a probationer was in a particular time and place during an incident. This could immediately help in identifying any witnesses, additional victims, or suspects. This revision could also immediately help investigators eliminate a probationer as a possible suspect. This has now been restricted specifically by juvenile probation, at least in the Omaha area. Requiring either a court order or warrant for this information is time-consuming, difficult if not impossible during off hours to accomplish, and as previously stated, we believe to be unnecessary. Immediately acting on investigative leads that this information can provide is crucial to the solvability of crimes. We believe the passing of this bill would continue to improve our working relationship with probation. Not every probationer is assigned an electronic monitoring device. Only those who a judge or probation has determined should have one. Most often, those individuals who may require extra supervision to keep a community safe. Probation is an alternative to detention that creates an opportunity for someone convicted of a crime to avoid incarceration, but with proper implementation, still provide safeguards for the community. We should not diminish its effectiveness by restricting this information or making it so difficult for law enforcement to have access to.
You did fine.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Senator Moorfield.
Thank you for coming today. Can you give us some examples of how you can use this GPS information, just very practical?
Yeah, I have
a guess in my head, but.
Yeah, no, sure. Here's one that I had. I redacted some of the information just so it wouldn't be personal to anybody. On Tuesday, the 18th of August, 2020 at 04:11 a.m., a shot spotter activation indicated 11 rounds in an address near 41st and 4th Street. Patrol officers arrived and located gunfire damage to 2 separate homes. One of these homes had been targeted in 2 prior incidents. Through investigation, North Investigation Suppression detectives had developed a suspect. Through INCEGIS, it was determined he was on probation with a search clause. As a result of a probation search, the gun used in this incident was recovered. After the arrest of the probationer, there were no more incidents likely preventing a shooting or a homicide.
So you can use this information then to place people at certain locations where you have.
So it's kind of two-pronged here. We used to be able to have a tab on INCEGIS that would say probation. We still have U.S. probation for federal probation.
Okay.
The state was taken down.
Pardon me, we still have one?
We still have federal access to federal U.S. probation on INCEGIS. So we can look up somebody who's on U.S. probation, but the tab for state probation is completely gone. It was taken down, I think, like in a day. We lost all that information. I've been told that we can scroll through some of the documents and try to find what the sentencing was and some of the court documents to figure out that they were on patrol. But we used to be able to click on that tab, immediately show whether they're, yes, actively on probation or not, and what some of their, if they have a search and seizure clause, who their probationer is, and their email address, so that we could immediately reach out to that specific probation officer.
Okay.
I've been told they were trying to re-add it back on for whatever reason. I don't want to speak for probation or INCEGIS administrators, but that hasn't been done, and it's been quite some time now.
Okay, thank you.
Senator McKinney.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. Got a few questions. How would we be able to track that the police isn't abusing this? Because that's my fear, is that you're allowed to do this and it gets abused, and you're just running into people's houses without any kind of process about going into those houses, because currently you need a warrant or probable cause, but without that, I fear, just me, that it could be abused, and I don't think that's out the realm of thinking.
Obviously, there has to have some self-discipline there. With that being said, we can't just run into somebody's house, even if they're on probation. We used to, and this is something that we're still doing with adults. I actually have a website that they gave us access to that we can immediately look up an adult probationer's GPS ankle monitor at any time and see where they're at. What we're being restricted from is juvenile information. Even when we do probation checks, we used to every month go out with probation officers. We were their security for their probation check. If that probationer refused or their parents refused to allow us to search, we did not search. The probation officer then went back through their court process with whatever violations that they do for not complying with that particular procedure.
See, that's my fear, is you said juveniles, and I'm just thinking, what if you guys want to search a juvenile, his parents not around? And me being in a juvenile in those type of situations before, it's not the friendliest situation, and it's usually stop what you're doing. We need to search you. It's not that smooth of a process. So how can we track that? Is my concern. I understand like if somebody's on probation and you guys may suspect them of something, but I also believe there needs to be some type of checks and balances. And I fear this change wouldn't allow for any checks and balances.
So I'm trying to see how this bill would change that in relation to your question. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but
I
even,
guess, can you
yeah, go ahead.
clarify how this would help you, and then I could better respond to you?
So oftentimes, let's say we have a shooting at 30th and Benton Street. Okay. So we'll have a shooting when I worked in the assault unit. We'd have a shooting at 30th and Benton Street. I could immediately get on with juvenile probation, adult probation, and say, hey, did any of your individuals that are on ankle monitors at this specific time, place, were they in that area? They could then give me that information right away, so we could either start following up on leads before evidence can get destroyed, or we can immediately try to eliminate them as a potential suspect to move on.
Okay. So I guess I'm confused a little bit. How would it help you though? So if this change happens, how will you still be able to see it? If you're saying you can't see the tab?
There's two changes. One is to put probation information just so that we can actually see the person's on probation.
Okay.
Which that can help patrol officers that do a traffic stop. And they may not know that John Doe is on probation for a violent offense or a weapons charge. They won't have that information. They'd have to physically try to get a hold of a probation officer to get that information. So that's one aspect of this revision of this bill, I believe. The second aspect is to add GPS monitor location information to be able to give that immediately to law enforcement, as we have had it and we still have with adults, without going through what is a needless court process.
Yes, that's where I'm hesitant when you say needless. I don't know.
It's very cumbersome.
No, I understand like the process is.
I can give you an example that I just had with an adult. On Christmas night,
Yeah.
we had a shots fired. Hour or two later, we have an individual who's shot, goes to the hospital. He's on an ankle monitor. We don't believe he's fully being cooperative with us. We're not sure what the details of what happened to him were, but there was some concern at one point that that individual may have been a retaliatory shooting for the shots fired that occurred the hour or two prior. He's on parole. I call parole, their emergency line, and I'm told that I need to either get a subpoena to send to the Attorney General's office, or we need a search warrant. Even if I take the time to go to a judge and try to draft a search warrant for that information, trying to find a parole officer who can then get that information to me in a timely manner so we can immediately remove whether this individual was a suspect or a victim of that prior shooting is very cumbersome. And
I understand it's
Yes.
cumbersome, but I'm comfortable with that process because you've already have identified a potential victim or suspect, and now you just got to go through the process. And I think once you decrease the amount of steps you got to go to, that's my fear is some things aren't done the best. And I'm not saying you have any ill intentions.
Yes.
I just know, just from experience, there's been situations where steps were crossed and lines were crossed. And I think once you start decreasing the steps in which you have to take to maybe arrest somebody or eliminate it, that's my fear.
well, I think the urgency is important.
I understand the urgency.
Because if we do-
But if the person you use in your example is in a hospital shot,
Okay.
Maybe we just got two different
There's-
perspectives. I don't necessarily see it as a direct threat if the person's in the hospital.
There's
So why
many
not?
different answers, if scenarios. If we have an individual same scenario, we have an individual who's shot at 30th and Benton Street. We don't know who the suspect is, okay? I try to call probation if I can get a hold of them, and they tell me I need to go get a search warrant. If I even try to argue that there's exigency there, okay, that this person could go shoot another person, or it could go in an ongoing situation that we have, we're at the mercy of probation to determine whether that's exigent or not, okay? In my opinion, that's not constitutionally protected information of a government-ordered monitoring device for an adjudicated individual. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy of that information. Why delay that when we can immediately get the information that we need to either rule them out or
I guess
include
just
them so that we can
because-
find witnesses, victims, suspects?
I guess we just have a difference of opinion. Just because somebody's on parole or probation, they've been adjudicated, I just don't think we still take away their rights through the process. And I think eliminating some of the steps in the process takes that away. I understand you may think it's a serious situation, but I just think that's where I'm at with it. If we erode some of these things, there will be lines crossed. And you could tell me it won't, but I just fear it, and I'm almost sure it's gonna happen. That's all. And
Sure.
I appreciate where you're coming from.
No, I appreciate it. And I don't know if this will change the situation or try to clarify some of this, but I can assure you, we don't have the staffing to sit here and just consistently watch people's GPS information. This is usually very specific to an incident that we're trying to follow. I don't think it's necessarily taking somebody's rights away, because I'm not an attorney, but I don't believe that is a reasonable expectation of privacy of that information. Massachusetts ruled on it. They have a statute that's got verbiage in line with this. I haven't even checked any other states. I just happen to know that Massachusetts had a case that was on point with this particular situation. So I hope I answered those as clearly as I can.
Thanks.
Senator Pansy Brooks
Yes.
has some questions for you.
Thank you for coming, Sergeant Stricker.
Yes.
My only thought would be that in law school, one of the most important things I learned in constitutional law was don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this, in my opinion, sets kids up to possibly being in the wrong place. How long would the reach of the law go? 10 miles because they might have a car, 30 miles because they might have a car or might be able to get away? I mean, every child could be suspect, correct?
No, I mean, typically, again, to go to an example, if we have a shooting at 30th and Benton, this information is, in my experience, very accurate where their GPS is. We're asking for that specific moment in time at that location, and that does not automatically make them a suspect. It can make them a witness, it can make them a victim, an additional victim, or yes, it could make them a suspect that we need to do follow-up on.
And the other idea is, what about limiting it to certain felonies?
You mean limiting us to be able to have this information just for
Yeah.
particular felonies?
Yes.
Again, I think are you asking about the GPS information or the probation information?
The
On and
GPS
seizures.
information.
Again,
I mean, so
it's my understanding that
if
this is,
somebody stole something, a bag of potato, I don't know, $100 or something, you get involved, or I don't know, $300 from a liquor store or something. Every single thing, we're going to be able to look at that and determine if there was a child in that area that could have done it.
yeah, I don't foresee us,
I know, but not
Again,
in maybe not in a big city, but maybe in a smaller city.
understand. I would probably go back to, again, that not everybody's on an ankle monitor. Not all these juveniles are on an ankle monitor. It's specific individuals who have shown a pattern of violence or concern to the community, and this is their alternative to incarceration. I don't think we should diminish that ability so that there's essentially almost, some of these individuals have a complete lack of respect for probation and its terms. And I think it's important that we work hand in hand with probation to make sure that they're in compliance.
Some have complete respect for it as well.
Yes, they do.
So we're looping everybody into the
No, I'm not.
non-respectful group.
I said some.
Right, but by this bill, we'll be looping all the young kids into a category of the disrespectful ones. Well, thank you so much.
I don't think that's necessarily the case, but
Okay, thank you so much for coming today, Sergeant Stricker.
Senator McKinney has some more
Yes.
questions for you.
To follow up on your hypothetically say, I'm on an ankle monitor.
yes.
I didn't commit a violent crime, but I'm on an ankle monitor for something. and I'm just at the wrong place at the wrong time,
Mhm.
and I'm on probation or parole, is it true that police conduct could trigger a violation?
What do you mean?
Like if I'm on probation or parole and I have any interaction with police, could that potentially get me violated?
I don't believe so. We've had even instances, like if we have this information put back on Insidious, where we've had contacts with somebody who's on probation or parole and they're nervous about it, and we've emailed their probation officer
But
saying, hey, there was.
even though you may not have seen it happen, is it possible to get violated just from having that interaction? Let's say, for example, a shooting happens.
Okay.
I didn't do the shooting, but I just happened to be in the wrong spot at the wrong time. But I'm questioned about a shooting. That could be a violation. Is that true?
I'm not aware of what the violation would be.
It just police conduct in general.
I don't think having contact with police justifies a violation. I don't know the stipulations of probation. I'm not on that side of it, but I don't believe that would in any way be a violation. I don't see how it would.
All right. Because that's the thing. It's, yeah, you want to catch the serious offender, but in trying to do so, you may corral more than what you actually are looking for. And police contacts with Black individuals and brown individuals is not always the best. Okay. And we could go back to the stuff that's been happening all over the country for those examples. So that's my fear, is that, yes, you're trying to target a specific population, but in doing so, you corral the whole population, which increases police contact with my community, for example, and that's not always the best situation. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a couple of
Yes.
questions, just generally, so I understand what this looks like.
Yes.
If you're in your cruiser, there's a shooting at 30th and Benton. Before, there was this change in interpretation and this button disappeared that you guys used to touch. You roll up to 30th and Benton, you see bullet holes in the side of a house or the side of a car, or someone has been shot. Is there something in your cruiser or in your, that you have access to, that you push it and go, who had an ankle monitor that was within 2 blocks of this in the last half hour?
No, if I understand your question correctly. So we arrive at a shooting.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you talked about this, like, we used to have a button
Yes.
that we could touch.
Yes.
I assume you have a laptop in your
Yes.
cruiser. And if you roll up to 30th and Benton because the shot spotter went off and now you're down there trying to figure out if somebody got shot at, what is it? How do you access who was there in the circle of?
We don't. That's so part of the bill is adding probation information back to Insidious. So theoretically, they could show up if they had an individual that for whatever reason they wanted to look them up on Insidious, they could click the tab and show that they were on probation.
So you got to have somebody in mind.
You have to have somebody in
I'm in 30th
mind.
and Benton, so I'm thinking that it's Josh Henningsen that probably did it. Let me check.
Yes, so we have to have somebody in mind to click up and look up their Insidious information. We don't, I recently I think they gave us access to adult probation for our particular unit to look at GPS information for adults. Previously, the way that we would do that in your scenario is we'd have to call probation because that information is not on Insidious. It would just show that they're on probation. We'd say, hey, we show that this individual's on probation. Can you tell us if their ankle monitor puts them in that particular area at that time? They could then tell us. That's now.
But you don't have access to anything that will tell you who was in the area in the last 30 minutes.
With adults now, we do have, they've given us some access to that. Juveniles is completely no. We have to get a hold of juvenile probation and say, hey, we suspect this individual. Are they on probation? Because we don't have it on Insidious anymore. They would say yes or no. And then unless there's some sort of exigency, they would tell us you need to go get a search warrant or a court order for this
I'll
information.
give you a different scenario.
Okay.
Shot spotter goes off and there is a bunch of young people at 30th and Benton. I'm not familiar with that, so I'm
Yeah.
just going to put a gas station there.
Sure.
With a convenience store. And a bunch of kids are running in every direction when you get there, but the shot spotter tells you that's probably where a shooting just happens. Can you access something in the GPS that says who was there in the last
Adults.
20 minutes?
Adults, not juveniles. Juveniles have been taken down, from my understanding, through some different
Would
interpretation of
that
the
change
statute.
with this bill?
Yes, it would, absolutely.
Okay.
And
Now-
the big point, if you don't mind, the big point of that is good that you brought up is if we were trying to do, let's say we want to do a search warrant, okay, or we're required to get a search warrant or a court order. To me, the concern would be is yes, we could take that information, although time consuming and to me, it's not a constitutionally protected information. But we go and we draft a search warrant for that information if we have a particular individual. My concern is we've been able to with adults, and we can still do it with adults, but we can't with juveniles, is there is no drag search. So if I have to try to, obviously I believe probation has that access, but if I want to write a search warrant for 30th and Vinton that a bunch of 16, 15, 16-year-olds ran from and we just had a shooting, now I'm trying to get a search warrant with what specificity? That time, that location, but I don't have a specific individual. I don't know if that will be an issue or not. And again, I think we're going down this rabbit hole of this path that I think it falls back on, is this a reasonable expectation of
Yeah, I
privacy
get
of
that.
information?
I get that. And all I'm trying to do is understand.
Yes, absolutely.
The information we're talking about.
Yes.
So if this bill passed, is there some place where you could just go and look at which 15 and 16-year-olds were at 30th and Vinton
No.
a half hour ago?
No, because we'd have to get a hold of juvenile probation and say, hey, we had a shooting here. Do you have any juveniles on an ankle monitor that were in this area?
Even if this bill passed?
Yes, it's not going to be put onto and see. I don't ever recall GPS information being put onto in CJIS.
Okay.
Typically, the way we do this before it stopped, and we do it with adults, is we can call them up, say, we had the shooting at 30th and Vinton. Did you have anybody on an ankle monitor here? Adult will tell us, juvenile will not without a court order or a search warrant because of some interpretation of a statute.
Okay. But you're still gonna, even with this bill, you're still gonna have to call and say, do you have any juveniles at 30th and Vinton a half hour ago?
For GPS information, yes.
Okay.
To my knowledge, we would.
I got another question.
Yes.
You said that conditions of probation can include a search and seizure provision or clause.
Yes.
Okay. And so that, I presume, means that somebody said, yeah, I'd rather be on probation than have some kind of detention. So I signed that form and agreed to what? That somebody can search me or my car anytime?
Yeah, I think typically the way it is it used to show us if they were under a search and seizure clause, if I recall correctly. And typically what we would do is we would get a hold of probation. Probation would go with us. We're not usually doing those searches ourselves unless we call probation and probation tells us, yes, go ahead.
Okay.
And that person still has to be compliant with that search.
All right. No, let me stop you there. If you're driving down 30th and Vinton, there was a shooting somewhere, and you see Josh Henningsen driving around, and you remember him. It's like, I know that he's somebody he's always in trouble, and there he is. Can you pull him over? Like you hit this button and you go, yep, he's got a search and seizure clause in his probation order. I'm going to pull him over and then pull him out of the car and search him or his vehicle.
Again, I'm not an attorney, but I would think we'd still have to be able to establish probable cause before we conducted that particular search. So if he's leaving the area of a shooting, I'd have to be able to articulate my reasonable suspicion or probable cause to pull him over to begin with.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes.
And not because I'm arguing with you, but
Yes,
just
no.
so that I can understand. If you have access to this, you hit the button and by God, Josh has this search and seizure provision in his thing. You think you still, even though that's in there, you still need probable cause and you still need what?
I personally do. If he's leaving in a vehicle, I have to have some sort of articulable reasonable suspicion
So
to
that
make that
search and
initial
seizure
contact.
provision isn't a green light to stop him on the street or stop him in a park or anywhere else you see him and pat him down?
In my
Look in his
experience,
pockets?
I guess, I'm not sure. In my experience, we don't really do that.
Okay.
Me personally, I would.
Not to be
yes.
argumentative,
No,
I'm
go ahead.
asking you if you could, not do you?
trying to think of other similar hypotheticals so I can answer it appropriately.
And I'm just
I
trying to
guess-
get a fix on what we're talking about with one of these provisions and what you would then have access to
I guess
and what you could do with it.
I guess I suppose it's plausible because a lot of times when we'll go out with probation, it's their time to do their checks on these certain individuals, and some of them they consider dangerous, so they like law enforcement to go with them. So we'll get an email saying, hey, I need to go check on John Doe. Can you come with me? We have a search and seizure. He has a search and seizure clause. I'll send my officers with probation to go make that contact, whether it's at a house or wherever they come in contact with that individual with. And if that probation officer decides that they want to enforce that search and seizure, they will search it.
But if let's say that I'm just trying to understand,
Yes.
it's not
No,
arguing.
totally, go ahead.
So that I know really what we're talking about, because this is the GPS is one thing, but this is a part that I want to better understand. You're sitting in your cruiser, you're in the gang unit, you're at 30th and Spencer, and you see Josh Henningsen go by, and you're like, he's on probation, and he's got one of these search and seizure clauses. Let's pull him over. Do you still have to have probable cause? If he has a search and seizure clause, or is that your green light to stop him anytime you want for any reason?
I don't think that's our green light to do that. We're not probation, we're law enforcement. So I think we would fall back to that. We still have to have some articulable reason to do a traffic stop on this individual. And then
Okay.
we won't search that individual without probation's approval.
And is that statutory, a constitutional provision, or just practice? If you know.
I'm not certain
Okay.
if it's statutory.
Well, I think I better understand it, and I see some other people behind you, so we may get a little more context for this. But yeah, I appreciate your testimony. Thanks for being here.
Yep, thank you.
Next proponent. Good afternoon, welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Colleen Rickard. It's COLLEENRICKARD. I'm a foster parent of over 35 years. I am very much for LB 1010. Reason why, as a foster parent, I have seen both the officers not be able to get the correct information, one, on the juveniles when they've ran. As a foster parent, we have to report if a child's ran. Sorry.
Are you nervous?
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
very nervous. I'm
Okay, let
sorry.
me put you at ease. We're not going to interrogate you. We're
It's-
just here to listen to what you have to say, and you don't need to be nervous, okay?
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Go ahead.
With this juvenile, we've had guns pointed at us twice. My husband had a knife pointed at him. And unfortunately, the officers were not aware of what this child had done before. And that's one reason why I think that it's important that these officers are aware of what these kids are capable of doing. Don't get me wrong, we've had good kids, we've had bad kids, but this child needs major help. And I have seen, unfortunately, HHS take this child. He was not in our care, he was in another home. This juvenile, I should say. He was on probation for stealing a car, methamphetamines, other things. He got on Facebook Live and literally had a gun and was threatening to kill myself, my husband, and our foster daughter. And they caught him. But unfortunately, he was only in jail for 3 days then placed back in foster care in Lincoln here. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine, you're
Um,
fine.
And he was on the run for 3.5 weeks, and we had no way of knowing. We were in charge of a state ward, and we had no way of knowing that this child was on the run again. And if the officers would have known, we could have protected this child. Unfortunately, the same thing happened all over again. It was on Facebook Live, and as the victim of this, the VINE program that used to be in effect as a victim is no longer in effect, and it is not in effect for juveniles. So as a victim, we have no rights when it is a juvenile criminal. We are not notified when the juvenile criminal is released or on the run. It had been 3.5 weeks. And I think that the law needs to be changed, that the victims need to be able to be notified. Just by probation, HHS could contact us, send us a text, an email. I mean, we had one of the state wards in our care who was being threatened again. I think that the officers have to have more abilities to be able to protect we the people. And if we don't stand up and give our officers the tools to be able to protect us, you know, I could go on and on with this child. I mean,
Sounds like you had a bad experience. for
yeah,
sure.
and the sad part is he was released from our home, was in jail for like 3 or 4 days, then was placed in another home in this area, stabbed the foster family, and was on the run for 3.5 weeks before we were notified. And the only reason why we were notified was because he was on Facebook Live threatening to kill us again.
Okay. Well,
Any questions? Yes.
Senator McKinney.
Thank you. I just want to, sorry about your situation. I just wanted to ask, did this individual that you're speaking of have any behavioral health or mental trauma issues?
Drugs and issues. He's been picked up for methamphetamines
Okay.
more than once. We fought for getting mental health and stuff, but unfortunately, the HHS worker decided to ask the juvenile if he wanted to go to someplace in Omaha to get counseling and stuff instead of just picking him up and taking him there at age 14. And so needless to say, the juvenile said no, he did not want to go there. And it was delayed once again. And the juvenile was pushed back in the system. And here we are today.
Yeah, no, I asked that because it seemed as though it was a young individual that was dealing
Yes,
with those
he-
type of issues. And I think that's important to point out, not to diminish the situation, but I think when we have young individuals that are dealing with those type of crises, we have to be careful. Not only for you, but also for that individual, because
And that's why I think it's important that the victims, myself, or anybody else that's a victim, can be notified by law enforcement or by probation or HHS or all three, just so we can protect ourselves as well as the juveniles that are within our care, as well as that juvenile that's on the run. This juvenile that I'm talking about has cut his ankle monitor off 13 times that I'm aware of.
no, I understand. And I'm not trying to diminish your situation, and appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Pansy Brooks.
Thank you so much for coming today. I think it's so important to hear your story, and
It's heartrending for sure and scary. I'm sure it was very scary.
It was very scary, and the juvenile that was in our care, she cried almost for over a week and a half at night, having horrible nightmares, screaming out in the middle of the night and stuff. We finally get her calmed down, and then the criminal juvenile was out running again and contacted her again. And for her to find out, not HHS to contact us, not law enforcement, not probation, you know, that's what's frustrating. There is no reason why, I know for a fact that HHS, when a child is on the run, my job as a foster parent is to contact HHS and let them know that that child is on the run. That HHS worker has to fill out 105 questionnaires contacting the FBI, the Sheriff's Department, all probation and everybody else. On that piece of paper, that one questionnaire, it could be added. If for probation has all that information, it would not be that hard for them to say, contact the victim. Let them know that this child is on the run. Because all of that is done within the first hour. And if it is going to save a state ward's life or somebody else's life, just to add one line and have a probation officer contact the victims, I don't see where the problem is.
Okay, first off, I'm not sure that this gives law enforcement the ability to warn victims, which is a whole
There
nother
is a
issue.
victim witness group
Yes.
that in Buffalo County, and I have worked with them before for other things with the different children that we've had in our home. And unfortunately, because the criminal is a juvenile, we cannot be notified. The juvenile has more rights than the victims do at this point in time.
So
And that's wrong.
I don't understand why he wasn't arrested. The
Which time?
any of them? What
And
if,
he
if
was,
he's, if he's
but I just
threatening
found-
with a knife? I'm just
Yeah.
interested why.
He was.
And he's violent and should be off the streets.
I totally agree with you. I just found out Thursday that there was a court date. Mind you, he was charged within our case alone, 3 counts of terroristic threats. 3 counts, that's 6 counts of terroristic threats. He also stole the car. If he pleaded guilty to stealing the car, our counts don't count. What happened to us don't count. So now I have no rights whatsoever to be able to contact victim witness, probation, or anybody else to find out when this child or juvenile is on the run.
Well, there's no question that we need to be protecting people who are at high risk like this. So I'm sorry that happened. I'll ask some of the people behind how this could address that issue, because that's concerning.
Yeah, I spoke with Senator John Lowe in regards to it, and he had no idea that this was even there. I don't know what to do. And as a mother and a grandmother and a foster care mom, it's my responsibility to take care of our children and to teach them right from wrong. And if I can't stand up and tell you guys, this is wrong, something needs to be changed. And if you don't give our law enforcement the tools that they need to protect all of us, it's wrong.
Thank you.
I just,
Thank you for coming. I appreciate your story.
You came all the way from Kearney?
we came from Gibbon.
Yeah. Well, thanks for making the trip.
I got the call from Pat from John Lowe's office yesterday at a little after 4:00, and he goes, Colleen, this doesn't have anything to do with that bill, but it does have to do with that bill. Could you please show up?
Okay.
And so that's why I'm here. And it really wouldn't take that much, guys. I mean,
Right.
just to put that on that bill.
Well, we'll ask one of the guys coming up right behind you how that works.
I hope so.
Okay, thank
Thank you, guys.
Have a good trip back. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Jason Wesch. It's Jasonwesch, and I'm here on behalf of the men and women of the Lincoln Police Union in support of LB 1010, a bill that we see as a valuable investigative tool for law enforcement and a benefit to adults and juveniles on probation and their families. Having immediate access to information about who is on probation or parole will aid law enforcement in any number of circumstances and allow us to work seamlessly with probation and parole officers. It would help us build upon already established working relationships with local probation officers that have been earned over a period of time. Working together on such projects as Safe Neighborhoods, which is a grant-funded effort that pairs law enforcement and probation officers together to check on adults on probation and help employees from both offices learn about each other's jobs. The sharing of information is a key component to our continued working relationship with probation. I personally don't see any drawbacks from LB 1010 as it would work to the advantage of persons on probation or parole, youth on probation, parents, and law enforcement. Some of this information currently requires legal process of some form before law enforcement can have access, which works to the detriment of the investigation. The ability to access GPS locations of a juvenile on electronic monitoring would increase safety for all involved. Well, I think this would come into play only in limited circumstances. It could be vital to the safety of a troubled youth in a bad situation. If there are concerns about confidentiality, our agency already has policies in place to protect confidential information, and only certified employees have access to such information. The state monitors information obtained by individuals through NCGIS and carefully screens inquiries for potential misuse. With the access to information provided by LB 1010, law enforcement would be an extension of probation, increasing the effectiveness of the program. Having knowledge of probation and being able to work with a person's probation officer in a timely manner increases the available resources, which works to create a safe outcome for all involved. And if I could go back a little bit to some previous testimony and just try to quickly clear up some questions that were asked, just based on my experience. I've been an officer and then a sergeant for 19 years here in Lincoln, and we work very well with probation. I think even a person on probation deserves all the respect and rights that other citizen has. Just because there's a search clause doesn't mean that we can walk up to them and search them. Yes, if I contact a person on probation and I know there's a search clause, I'm going to point that out to them. But if they say no, then that's no. There is no search. It's done. Does that violate their probation? That isn't up to me. That's up to the probation officer. You asked earlier, sir, if I saw the other officer, if he saw someone on probation driving down the street, can you stop them? Absolutely not. Definitively no. And I just think with juveniles and the GPS tracking, it was mentioned about software. Will we have access to a map that shows them? No, we won't have that. We'll have to call probation. They'll have to tell us this person was in the area, depending on the circumstances. Really, it just, yes,
So
sir.
if you have, just to follow up on my questions that I had before, if you have access to this and you see Josh Henningsen, and you know Josh Henningsen is somebody that gets in trouble a lot, or maybe he's gang involved, and he's driving down the street and you type his name in and you now hit that button and it says, you're not to hang around with Lathrop, or that's a violation of your probation. Can you stop him for that?
No, I'm not a probation officer. If I made that observation and I was sure that those two people were together, maybe I'd call his probation officer and just say, hey, I want to work with you guys. I saw these two together. I can do a report about it if you wish, but I cannot stop them. I cannot.
And you can't, there's nothing, I'm not familiar with this screen that everybody wants access to.
Absolutely.
So if you pull up Henningsen, can you see where he's at? And
No.
like you can't see from GPS that
No.
he's actually at 30th and Vint?
No.
Okay. That answers my question. Senator DeBoer.
So let me give you another hypothetical and you kind of walk
Sure.
me through it, if that's all right.
Sure.
So if I get a call from somebody, they saw Lathrop hanging around with Henningsen, and you're looking for Lathrop, but Henningsen has an ankle monitor on him. Can you call up Henningsen's probation officer and ask, hey, they got in a car together, where's Henningsen?
Yes,
Okay, and then the next thing would be to say, they're driving some direction. Could you continue to talk to that person until you could get, find out where they were and sort of chase Henningsen that way?
yes,
And then you would, whenever you got there, presumably be able to find Lathrop because he was with Henningsen?
yes.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Morfield.
Thank you for coming, Sergeant Welch. This is helpful. So just going back to the screen, this is getting into the weeds a little bit. So the screen just basically says that person's on probation, who to contact. So you don't have to go and call the hotline and, spend 15 minutes on that. And is that
Right.
correct?
It just makes it easier.
Just makes it
Helps
easier.
us work with probation and just makes it easier, yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Otherwise, if you want to know where somebody was, then you got to go through the process of getting a judge to sign a warrant to tell you where Henningsen was when the shooting happened at 30th and Penn.
Yes. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but LP 1010 doesn't cover GPS info for adults, only
It
juveniles.
doesn't cover what?
The GPS tracking information for adults. It only talks about for juveniles with GPS.
I understood from the previous testifier that they already have access to that for adults. We're only talking about juveniles today.
Right, that's all I was trying to clarify. Yes.
Senator McKinney.
Thank you. What's the role of a law enforcement officer in the city, in Lancaster County?
What is the role?
Yeah,
Just in general to enforce the laws, keep the peace, serve the public?
what's the role of a probation officer?
The same or similar?
Do you not see there maybe being some type of potential conflict having such a close relationship between law enforcement and probation, where the rules and the lines can get skewed a little bit? Because when you say you can't just walk up on somebody, I won't say it happens in Lincoln, but I've seen firsthand multiple occasions officers knowing an individual has that search clause in their probation file, and they search them. And if they refuse, they get arrested on the spot. And that's troubling for me in a lot of ways. But I also think we have to be careful not to compare juveniles to adults. There's a reason why there are adults and there's juveniles. And just try to have a cookie cutter standard for both juveniles and adults can be problematic. And we have to be careful in doing so.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have one more question. So Ms. Rickard came from Buffalo County to tell us her concern about law enforcement not letting her know that a juvenile was on the run, who may or may not pose a threat to Ms. Rickard or her family. Does this have anything to do with notifying the victim's family?
No.
Okay. I just want to make sure I didn't miss something, but I appreciate your testimony and thanks for being here today.
Sure.
Welcome back. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop, Senators of the Judiciary Committee. Good afternoon. My name is Jim McGuire, Jim Maguire. I'm President of the Nebraska Fraternal Order Police, and I'm also here in kind of a dual capacity representing the Omaha Police Officers Association. So when we're talking about LB 1010, we are here to support that bill enthusiastically. I know a lot of previous testimony has already touched this, so I'm not going to kind of repeat myself too much. But just to clarify, we used to be able to have access to this information, and all we're asking is that we can have this information again when it comes to the insidious part. I have talked to numerous chiefs and sheriffs throughout every corner of the state, and they all agree that we need to have this information. It's about, a lot of it has to do with the safety of the street cop. So if we make a traffic stop, before we would know, hey, this person's on probation, and they're out with, certain people, they may be going down a path to where they may start getting in trouble. Well, if we can intervene and stop that before it happens, let's do that. So that part right there would be very beneficial so that we know, okay, this person's on probation. So we may have to type up a little report that says, okay, on such and such time, the person wasn't doing anything wrong. This is what we did have contact with them. Now, regarding the GPS, it talks about an alternate form of detention, which is basically incarceration. And this is this ankle monitor that we're talking about is a form of incarceration. And we should have access to the GPS portion to show, okay, if God forbid that we have a shooting in even if it's in Western Nebraska, and we know that there's going to be retaliatory shootings, if we can stop that as soon as we can, good for us, good for the community, good for the victims. That way we can get that person behind bars as soon as we can. So, like I said, a lot of the other testimony has already been brought up, so I'm not going to continue to speak. So,
Jim, at the risk of having you repeat something that somebody else has talked about, this sounds like something you used to have access to in your cruiser.
Yeah.
You're a cruiser officer in
Yeah.
Douglas County. And so tell me how that works. You have a laptop and you pull over Henningsen.
If you have, first you have to have insidious access. That's not for everybody.
But you want it in this case.
But you want it. You want it in this
So if you
case.
have it, what are you going to be able to know about him before you go up to his car door?
It'll show me why he's on probation, what the terms are, and who his probation officer is. And now we don't have any of that information. So I could pull over, let's say I've got
Which of those pieces of information are important to you? If you're approaching his car?
All of it is. The most important part is that juvenile, are they on probation? And why are they on probation? If they're on probation because they got an MIP, okay. But if they're on probation because they were involved in a shooting, I'm going to treat that a heck of a lot differently.
Talk to me about the GPS. If you're in your cruiser and you run down to 30th and Vinton because the shot thing goes off and you have a pretty good idea, or that's an indication somebody just shot a firearm at 30th and Vinton, what's the GPS doing for you that you want access to without going through the warrant process?
Right. For the street cop, we're not going to get that information. For the investigator that comes out, they're going to call probation, and probation is going to get that information to share with us.
What will they share with you?
They'll share, okay, so-and-so is on an ankle monitor. It shows on this time at this date. If you're asking, were they at 30th and Vinton? Yes, they were. They were there at that time.
Can probation look at a map that includes 30th and Vinton at a particular time and say, it looks like we had 7 ankle monitors down at 30th and Vinton, and
Yes.
here's who they belong to?
Yes.
Okay. And that's what you want to be able to get without doing a warrant?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I now understand the bill. Senator McKinney.
Quick question. Who was it the courts that changed the interpretation of this statute or law?
Yes, it was somebody within, I believe it was the Supreme Court Administrator's office, somebody in there.
Do you recall the reasoning?
They just said what you were doing before, you can no longer do.
Okay. Do you trust the courts?
Of course.
Because earlier today, not in this hearing, we've throughout this week, we've been told to trust the courts, because the courts, we need to stop trying to infringe on the courts. So if you trust the courts, why can't you trust the courts made the right decision?
We aren't saying that we don't trust the courts in this instance. What we're saying is that you should put a little faith in law enforcement to go out and and as aggressively as we can, stop violent crimes.
What about faith in the courts to make a decision to make sure law enforcement isn't overstepping their boundaries?
Well, I think that would play out. Let's just say hypothetically, this goes to a suppression motion, saying that they never should have had this. But with this change in the law, now it does. So that's all we're trying to change is just to give us
Okay,
that
but
information before.
Here's my response. Say you get this information, you find whoever you're looking for, and the person isn't the person that you really should be looking for, but because you encountered this person, the situation got escalated and this individual is killed, and there is no suppression motion because he's killed because you misidentified the individual.
Two parts to that. The first part is the whole goal was to, if we misidentified somebody, good for us because we can stop wasting our time with this person saying they were never there.
How's it good if they're dead?
Well, now that's going into a whole different situation because I can say
But what I'm
hypothetically,
saying,
why was this person a felon? And
what I'm
was he
saying
convicted of?
is interactions with law enforcement from my community across this country and in this state haven't been the best. And I understand you guys want to decrease protected public safety and all that. But what I'm saying is, if this is an opportunity to open up more contact, that is what I'm fearful of. Because I know what those situations are like.
I would say,
and you could say that you guys try to do the best within those situations, but
I would, when
far too many.
When you say that we're making all of these contacts, I would say the
Nebraska has
vast majority of those contacts are positive. There's only a small portion of those contacts.
So why does Nebraska have the 11th highest Black incarceration rate in the nation?
Well, now we're going to start getting into a whole different conversation because we could start talking about why do we have an abundance on, let's say, minority on minority crime? And when are we going to talk about the victims and that?
But majority of white individuals kill white individuals, am I correct? Majority of Latino individuals kill Latino individuals. Majority of, so when you go to this framing of minority on minority crime, also speak to most people that commit a crime against a white individual as white. The percentage is high, so don't just go there.
If we're going to have a legitimate conversation on percentages and what do the facts show?
Disproportionate amount of minority
We have a
contact.
disproportionate amount of minority victims.
And
That's what
minority
we
contact.
have. That's what we have. And we can go into go into the home, but a lot of this, if we can end the contacts at the juvenile stage, let's do that. Let's get them, if they are starting to trail off and they're on probation and we can get them back on track, absolutely, let's do that. And maybe this accomplishes that.
We've had these type of policies for years, and I'll just say they haven't worked. And I'll just leave it at that, and we could be done. Thank you.
I will say the one thing about having this conversation is I see Deb Minardi sitting in the back, and I'm sure she's going to be up here in a second to tell us why this change happened. And then you guys really don't have an opportunity to come back up and say, oh, now I understand why the policy changed. Here's why I disagree with it. So I think it's been helpful to ask questions to fully understand what the purpose of this proposed policy change is. And then we're going to find out after you sit down
Will do.
why that ever happened in the first place.
With
So,
that,
have a great weekend. Good to see you, and thanks for being here. Anyone else here is a proponent of LB 1010? Seeing none, we will take opposition testimony next.
Good afternoon. My name is Spike Eichel, S-P-I-K-E-E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T, appearing on behalf of the Nebraska Criminal Defense Attorney Association in opposition to LB 1010. I'll try to speak as quickly as I can. The bill has two general components, and you've heard them talk about changes to the statutes that relate to adults on probation and parole, and then statutes that relate to juveniles on probation. The parts that we find perhaps not as objectionable are sections 1 and 4 of the bills, and those are the statutory changes to the adult statutes that relate to identifying, letting law enforcement officers have easy access to the information on the NCJIS system relating to whether the person's on probation, the name of the probation officer, and the conditions of probation. It sounds like from what I heard before, they're not necessarily blocked from GPS information if they can learn the identity of the probation officer. I'm guessing that there might be some bug or feature of the system somehow that doesn't let them law enforcement officer easily in the field figure out who to call to find this information out. I'm speculating a bit. That's not so bad because admittedly, as somebody said earlier, adults who are on probation probably don't have any kind of expectation of privacy in there. The parts about the juvenile probation are more problematic for us. First, not every adult who's on probation has been found guilty of a crime. It's a consequence of a criminal sanction that they are serving. That's probation. Not every juvenile who's on probation has been convicted of a crime or adjudicated on a crime. You know from the debate earlier this week on the floor that many juveniles are on probation for non-law violations, for things like truancy. And juveniles who have an electronic monitoring are not there, as somebody said earlier, as an alternative to incarceration. The judge in the juvenile court proceeding has determined that an electronic monitoring system is good to help better that juvenile, to help rehabilitate that juvenile. It's not a tool of investigation. It's not an opportunity for law enforcement to use that. In truancy cases, many times, the judges will impose an electronic monitoring to make the kids go into school. They're abiding by a curfew and that sort of thing. I suspect that, and maybe Ms. Menardi can speak to it later on, that the reason there has been a reinterpretation of the statute is if you look at the statute that's amended by this bill, and it starts on page, what is it, 43, it's 43.2.108, and I think it's amended by this bill. And if it's not, that's a statute that's been amended a number of times and passed by the legislature that generally provides that information relating to a juvenile court proceeding, including the juvenile court's orders, evaluations, treatment conditions, those kind of things are statutorily confidential.
It's on page 8.
On page 8, okay, so you found it then. So that's what this bill is seeking to amend, and I'm guessing that that's what probation is finally reinterpreted. We would encourage the committee to not make that distinction. There are some juveniles who are released. One thing that's problematic about the bill, and it's confusing, is that, as somebody said earlier, you're going to provide a statutory right of access to law enforcement to have GPS data for juveniles who are wearing ankle monitors.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Do you have a problem if the juvenile's been adjudicated? So let's say they stole a car, they're up in juvenile court, they've been adjudicated, they had their trial, they had their opportunity to say, I didn't do it. And the juvenile court judge hears all the testimony and says, yeah, you did. And by the way, I'm going to place you on probation, and here's the terms of the probation. As opposed to somebody that has not been adjudicated or somebody who is a status offender.
Quick answer to your question, yes, I would, because they are adjudicated in juvenile court. The point of juvenile court is not to punish, is to rehabilitate. It's a different purpose. It's a different North Star. Everything the judge orders is in the best interest. But keep in mind, the prosecutors always have the opportunity of a certain crime, a certain age to charge it in criminal court, and that's a distinction. But if they're adjudicated in juvenile court, the point of juvenile court is to rehabilitate the youth. They should be entitled to some statutory right of privacy, because if they complete that probation successfully, you've got the sealing provisions and the other provisions of statute.
Okay, let me ask the next question. If the reinterpretation has left law enforcement with the only avenue is to secure a search warrant in order to secure this information, what would that search warrant, what would an affidavit in support of a search warrant look like? And are they ever going to have trouble doing it?
I'd say no. I mean, one of my
we're
members
just creating a speed bump here to an order that gets signed.
I don't think
anyway.
that when we're talking about children's rights of privacy, we should consider it needless. I don't think it's needless to have someone, have the state have to show something to a judge of probable cause. I don't know that the technology exists for them just even when they had access to find out, to enter a location address and find out in a circle all GPS. I'm guessing they had the identity of somebody back then, and then they could follow up on that. In other words, they had information from somebody telling them, somebody seeing them, something they hear or learn in investigation that these juveniles were there, these juveniles are on probation. Let's go and see what their GPS says at the time. And that last third step, that GPS access is now blocked unless they get a warrant. And I don't think that's a high hurdle. I'm told it can be done in
I wouldn't think
hours.
so.
It's
And
probable
I'm
cause.
guessing that it's pretty routine and generally granted. Yes, there was a shooting at 30th and Benton. We get there, nobody's around, and there's bullet holes in the car. And Judge, can we get access to the juvenile GPS information for that date and time? Yes.
Right.
This is one of those things to me that strikes me as concerning or complicated. And I appreciate, and we're pretty strong on protecting people's rights around here. But in my previous service, we looked into juvenile violence in Omaha. Senator Ashford took us on a journey through that. And we talked to a bunch of people who try to intervene before there's retaliatory shootings. So one gang member gets shot and a bunch of people show up at the hospital or pile into a car, and now they're over in somebody else's neighborhood looking for somebody in the rival gang to shoot. Isn't that a circumstance that we want law enforcement to know who was at 30th and Benton when the shots got fired, so they can sort that out and try to send somebody over there to go, wait a minute, before you run over to the other neighborhood, let's talk.
I think you do. That is a law enforcement responsibility. You want law enforcement to be able to do it, but probation is not law enforcement. They shouldn't co-opt a probationary team that's meant to rehabilitate youth. One thing I wanted to say is that somebody talked earlier about detention. People have an ankle monitor because they have been detained and have been released as an alternative to detention. In Douglas County, at least, the probation department doesn't do the electronic monitoring. That's done by the Youth Service Center with a private contractor. In other words, I don't know that the bill would even speak to that. And when you're talking about somebody who's a juvenile who's been detained and arrested for a law violation and then sort of released with an ankle monitor, that is a criminal proceeding. This is going to impact all of those youths who are put on probation for, yes, admittedly some law violations, but for truancy and status offenses. And I don't think we should just have law enforcement round up the usual juvenile suspects and start going through GPS every time something happens. I think they should at least be expected to follow a normal investigative process. And if it leads them to somebody, they should follow the steps, and they shouldn't be short-circuited for juveniles.
If I presented an affidavit to a judge and said there was a shooting at 30th and Benton, shot spotter demonstrated or told us that there was a shooting at 30th and Benton, we get down there and there's a bunch of bullet holes in the side of a car, can I get to the GPS tracking for that area at that time? Are they gonna get it?
I would think so. I mean, it's probable. It's more likely than not. This has this relevant information to learn.
Okay, so why are we making them go through that process? And you may wonder why a lawyer is asking you that question, but I am curious if it is just a speed bump in the process, delays the access to who was in the neighborhood so that these guys can go catch the bad guy, go get the shooter, or go over to the other neighborhood and try to intervene before there's another shooting. Why go through that process if it is as simple as you've just described and as likely to be granted as you've just acknowledged?
I suppose at some point we should at least honor the Fourth Amendment somehow, and respect it exists in some form, that some people are entitled to be left alone by the state to a certain extent, that we don't completely live in a police-run society, in a government-dominated system. I suppose there's at least that point.
Not lost on me, by the way.
I don't think that it is we shouldn't separate the means from the ends. I think that's just dangerous thinking. We should expect the state and law enforcement that has the ability to kill, that is allowed to lie and deceive juveniles when questioning, that they should be able just to sort of jump ahead in the process, particularly for juveniles who've never even been found guilty of a crime. Again, it looks like, and I don't want to say anything, that even for things like truancy cases that are going to be handled through the court system, kids can be on probation, and at times they'll have an electronic monitoring. That's not because they've committed any law violation. They need help, and that's the purpose of the court order with electronic monitoring. And I don't think that's a fair comparison to the adult that has an ankle monitor who's serving a crime, a punishment for a crime.
Okay. Senator DeBoer.
Thank you, Senator Lathrop. So pursuant to this conversation about whether or not the person has committed a law violation, I'm looking at the bottom of page 5. And the specific language of this statutory change is if the juvenile court orders electronic monitoring as an alternative to detention, or a probation officer determines that the electronic monitoring is appropriate as an alternative to detention. So it seems like those are, so is that going to get the status offenses? Because it seems like a status offense that wouldn't order detention for a status offense. Is that right or wrong? I may have missed that this morning.
Yeah, for a status offense, you can't be detained.
Okay,
That's
so
true.
So I don't think this statute would apply to those with status offenses. Is that right?
Well, and that's the reason I mentioned before, because if the probation officer sort of orders electronic monitoring, and I don't know the probation officer would necessarily determine that that's an alternative to detention, that's up to the court. That's the confusing part.
So maybe what we need to do is clean up the language here. Would that help?
It might help the introducer. It wouldn't help the point that I made.
I mean, it would limit it to folks who had committed a law violation as opposed to those who were, for some other reason, at a point where they had an ankle monitor.
Either had been adjudicated for a law violation or at least had been detained for a law violation, but yeah, not yet found guilty or adjudicated.
I mean, we could even specify having been adjudicated in lieu of detention, right? I mean, I think we could write that.
You could. The consequence of that would be that record component would no longer have that statutory protection of that statute I mentioned before. And I think that's an undoing of what the legislature has done. And maybe that's obviously up to you. But, we have made some gains, I would submit, in our juvenile justice system. We have fewer kids in detention. We have a lower recidivist rate. I know law enforcement officers may disagree, but that's one thing that is measurable, perhaps maybe the only positive measurable outcome of our correctional system, adult or juvenile.
So you're saying, sorry, it went fast, so I missed it.
Yeah.
So if I did it the way I was describing, we properly identified those youth that were wearing the ankle monitor specifically because they had been adjudicated for law violations. You said that would cause there to be a record?
Well, I think so, because if you look at that statute that starts on page 8, I'm guessing, and Ms. Minardi's here to explain, but I suspect when I read this statute and I read the bill and I saw the statute that was amended, I'm guessing that the probation department has determined that this statute provides some sort of statutory confidentiality or limitation on the dissemination of records relating to juveniles, including their GPS history. I'm speculating, but that's what I would guess. And this bill would undo that
By
putting in a statute that the law enforcement is entitled to it.
Okay.
They can get it now. They have to go through the inconvenience of the warrant.
But if they went through the inconvenience of a warrant, wouldn't there also be a record?
Yeah, but I mean, there would be at some point, yes.
Okay.
But I don't think it would be a record that would be uploaded or included in CJIS. That's not necessarily related to the juvenile and the adjudication of the juvenile's offense. Or a status, whatever it may be. That would be a record available related to whatever investigation they were pursuing. I mean, it would be somewhere, but it wouldn't be, at least I'm guessing, again, I don't know, we haven't heard from Ms. Minardi, but I don't think it would be part of whatever comes up when you enter someone's name on the NCGIS system.
Okay. All right, well, thank you.
I do have one question I want to ask, and this goes back to, and I tried to ask, I think, previous testifiers. If I pull up Henningson's name, he's a juvenile, he's been adjudicated, and it has as the term of his probation, what do they call them, search and seizure provision? Does that allow me as a law enforcement officer just pull him over and see what he's up to?
And he's an adult?
No, juvenile.
Juvenile. I would think that you can. I mean, I know, I think you can, I think it would.
Okay.
I mean, as far as
I don't know anything about those things. So
I faced
that's
it,
why I'm
it's not always, it's not common. I looked at some sample juvenile orders. I made copies and I thought when I read the statute, maybe I better not. I deleted the name and stuff, but I thought I better not do it. They didn't have that standard, in at least one of the juvenile orders, that standard search and seizure provision. It's typical, it's boilerplate in adult orders of probation, that you will be subject to a search and seizure with or without probable cause, day or night, by a law enforcement officer or your probation officer with or without a warrant or something like that. That's exactly how it reads. And I've lost
So if
suppression
I'm an
issues.
adult and if I'm an adult on probation with one of those clauses, can the law enforcement come over to my house and go through my house?
Sure. They may not as a
For any
practical.
reason, no reason at all?
Exactly. Any reason, no reason at all, just as a check. And they do that. They do these probation suites where they accompany probation officers and then just do the probation officer's caseload route, basically go in. Now, as a practical matter, I think if somebody resists, they may not do that for officer safety purposes, but as far as they do have the legal authority to do that.
Okay. And you don't know if they do it in the case of a juvenile?
I know in some juveniles, they do. The ones I brought today were for non-law violation adjudications.
Okay.
There were.
Okay. I think that's all the questions. Thanks for answering those and for your testimony and being here today. Anyone else here in opposition? Anyone here in a neutral capacity?
Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop.
I wish we could have started.
And members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Deb Minardi, Minardi. I am the Probation Administrator for the Supreme Court Administrative Office of the Courts and Probation. I'm here to testify today in a neutral capacity. My hope is to maybe fill in some of the blanks, in particular when we talk about the exchange of sharing data and information. And I'm kind of compartmentalizing, but also fill in some of the blanks around electronic monitoring. So to begin with, in relationship to the exchange of information, we've had a long-standing memorandum of understanding with the Crime Commission. As a matter of fact, this memorandum of understanding precedes myself and precedes Court Administrator Corey Steele. So the last time that the memorandum of understanding came up for review, we literally did an intensive review. And what we discovered as part of that review is that while we saw provisions that would allow probation to share certain information as it applied to adults, we could not find anything statutorily that allowed us to share information as it applies to juveniles. So we sat down to have a discussion about what that would look like futuristically and what information did we need to kind of change our practices in relationship to that. As we went down that process, part of that included a conversation with the Crime Commission, at which time we said, we really need to see whether or not we're going to be able to share any information with you or not. And at that time, that's when the information kind of ceased until we could get those decisions made. We have since that time determined that, as I mentioned on the adult side, that there is information that we can share and that programming has occurred. That computer programming. We have given that computer program to the Crime Commission, and now they're in the process of programming on that side to kind of reinstate that information that can be shared, such as probation officer and so on. I do want to make one point, though, is that the conditions of probation have never gone away. You keep hearing a reference to there's a tab that says probation and a tab that says court. The conditions of probation, both adult and juvenile, are available on that tab that references the court. But as law enforcement has said, that information is buried and can be very difficult to find. So we know that as well, but that information does still exist. On the adult side, as I mentioned, since we could not find any statutory authority, that's when the conversation started about, it doesn't appear that we should be sharing much of anything. And it was mentioned earlier, the court is the owner of the information. And so unless the court directs us specifically to share information, we have always taken the position that probation doesn't own those records, only the court owns those records and we can't share it. I'm going to shift really quickly over to electronic monitoring. You've heard a couple references today in relationship to adults and the sharing of electronic monitoring information. In those instances, the court order specifies that law enforcement may be notified. And when the court order does not specify, the officer cannot release that information and must go to the court and ask the court, can I now release that information to law enforcement? So we do have those provisions that do allow us to have those conversations with law enforcement when it is part of the court order. From there, I'll stop and entertain any questions that might help.
Senator DeBoer.
So let me see if I understand the last part that you just said. The reason that you can share the ankle monitoring data is because the court order that gave them the ankle monitor specifically says and can be shared with law enforcement.
Yes, and I do want to also be clear that there are instances in which the court does not include that as part of the court order. But when it is automatically included, then an officer could have that conversation on the spot with law enforcement. If it's not included, the officer would either have to go to the court and say, law enforcement's asking for this, or say, law enforcement officer, I can't give you this. You're going to have to ask the court in order to have that conversation.
And is that subject of or condition of the ankle monitor something that just applies to adults, or does that also apply to juveniles?
There are youth who are on probation and likewise have a condition of probation that includes an electronic monitoring ankle bracelet.
Okay. Now I'm going to show my ignorance. So the way you said it, that there are youth who, does that mean that they're not being adjudicated through the juvenile justice system and they're being adjudicated through the adult system?
No, I wanted to be clear about the fact that, part of the conversation that was happening earlier was a conversation around detention. And there are programs where someone may be in detention and a youth is released from detention on an electronic monitor. Okay? That's different than a juvenile being on probation and having a condition of probation that includes an electronic monitor. So it's important that we have that distinction.
Okay. So, sorry, one more time. The youth who are released on the ankle from detention, would they have those conditions set with it that the law enforcement are able to see whenever they want, or they have that?
And I hate to say it this way, but it depends. It depends upon, as an example, you heard testimony earlier that it may be the youth center who's running the detention alternative, and those conditions would be applied. It may be a judge who orders probation to have a pre-adjudicated supervision that might include a monitor. So that would be kind of, depends, and maybe where you're located.
Okay. I think I got it. Thank you.
Is this not available to law enforcement because the statute needs to be amended? Is it a separation of powers? By the way, I'm just going to parenthetically say, like the fight we're having between the IG and the court, or is this a philosophical issue because they're juveniles?
I think I'm going to answer that slightly different, Chairman, just by saying we're trying very hard to adhere to the letter of the law as it applies to what's in statute and what's not in statute. And if it's in statute, we're happy to comply. We don't see that it is in statute, and so we don't feel that we have the authority to share that information.
Do you have a judgment, and I appreciate you came up in the neutral capacity, but there is, it sounds like we have three classes of juveniles. One would be a status offender, right? Somebody who maybe they're runaways and the juvenile court put an ankle monitor on them, right? They haven't committed a law violation. Then we have somebody, and I'll use somebody who steals a car. Before they're adjudicated, we're talking about an alternative to detention and not somebody who's been adjudicated. And then the third class would be someone who's been the juvenile court equivalent of convicted, adjudicated, right? Is there a reason to treat any one of those three differently if the statute is to be amended?
I would say that it is judicial discretion in relationship to any of those scenarios as to why a judge may feel like it is important to utilize a tool like that. And so it could be beneficial in any of those scenarios. Again, it would be judicial discretion and by court order.
Okay, those are the reasons we put an ankle monitor on somebody. Judicial discretion in any one of those three. But as they do the order, putting an ankle monitor on somebody for any one of those three things, do they have other terms that affect when law enforcement should have access to the information?
As I mentioned earlier, if not specified in the court order, so in other words, a judge could say, you're on, you've been adjudicated, I'm putting you on electronic monitoring, period. And in that particular case, we would not share that information with law
Even if
enforcement.
we amended this?
Well, unless it was amended and said that we must. Otherwise, right now, if it says you're on electronic monitoring, we would not share that information with law enforcement. If it says you're on electronic monitoring and you may share this information with law enforcement, then we would.
Okay, I want to go back to one more thing you said, just to get clarity. They pull over Henningsen, he's a juvenile, he's in the system, and he's on probation. Are you telling me that on my laptop, if I'm a law enforcement officer, I can scroll through Henningsen's record and find this stuff if I want to look at 28 pages of fine print on my laptop in the cruiser? Or is there something in there they want to see that's not available?
Well,
is this just about make it more convenient for me?
you're not going to know the probation officer. You're not going to have that contact information with the probation officer. And the only thing that you're seeing are the conditions of probation.
Okay. Clear as mud. Okay. So currently, if I'm a law enforcement officer and I want to get any of this information for any one of these three classes of juveniles, I can get a warrant, go to a judge, get the warrant signed just by saying he was in the neighborhood, there was shots fired, and we want to see where he was at, or if he was in the neighborhood.
I also want to make one clarification in relationship to that, because I think this is, at least from my observation, appears that may not be clear. What was referenced earlier is like a law enforcement with their laptop. A law enforcement officer, and I want to speak for law enforcement, but historically what they're looking at is in sieges. So they're looking to see, are they on probation or are they not on probation? That's different than when you heard them reference, I can get into the computer and look at whether somebody or not is on electronic monitoring. That's a whole different system. That's a whole different, for lack of word, it's a whole different process. They're not interwoven. It's like, this is one app and this is the other app. And so you have to have permission to get into this electronic monitoring app by some of the ways that we've discussed.
The probation officer has that access.
Correct.
And these guys want to just pick up the phone and say, who was the 30th in Benton last night at 9 o'clock?
Or in some, as I said, in some instances, because you heard kind of two different versions, in some instances, when law enforcement engages in an agreement as well, they could have direct access into that app to look at that client.
In some circumstances?
As I mentioned, if law enforcement, and I'm going to use Omaha in particular because this is
Okay.
where it's used the most. In Omaha in particular, if the court has ordered that an individual is on electronic monitoring and law enforcement may have access to that live electronic monitoring, then law enforcement can have an agreement with probation that says, I'm only going to use it for this reason, and I'm only going to look it up for this purpose, and they have to sign off on that. So that's kind of our own interlocal agreement. And then at that point in time, they have a trained person that can go directly into that.
But that has to be in the order that
Correct.
law enforcement may have access to it.
Correct.
Otherwise, if we do this bill, they'll be able to have it automatic.
They would automatically, meaning they would call the office and say, are they on it? Or where were they?
Okay, but it's not like Google Earth where they can pull it up on their laptop and see where Josh is at.
Right. That's why I wanted to make reference that it's a completely different app. They have to have permission. They have to be trained and they have to sign off as a law enforcement agency that they're in this partnership with probation. And those are, in Omaha, we have that. That is not common across the state.
Okay. Anybody else have questions? Well, I thought it was we were just gonna blow through the afternoon and be out of here by 3. And then along comes this thing. And anyway, thanks for being here. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
hearing from you. Anyone else here in a neutral capacity? Seeing none, Senator Geist, you may close. And as you approach, I have 3 letters. 2 are proponents and 1 opponent.
Okay, it's not so early. I did want to clarify a couple of things. One of those was in reference, I believe that this was already asked, but I want to restate that for the woman who was here asking for notification, this bill does not speak to that. And I do also want to clarify that it's not our intention that truancy or status offenses, that's what we're looking at here. So if we need to clarify language in there to make sure that that's clear, we will do that. And I would say if there needs to be any other clarifying language to get to where we can get agreement on this in order, it's not just for law enforcement. This also helps keep youth safe. It keeps the victims safe. It keeps adults safer by people knowing where they are. And I'm just going to throw out, just so you all know, I have a number of families, and I referenced this on the floor the other day, who I've been working with. Their children are either on the run, or their on the run children are hanging out with children who have ankle monitors. If those parents who could have some sort of comfort knowing if something happens, someone can find my child, it gives great comfort to parents who find themselves in this situation with kids who are on an ankle monitor or are with kids who are. That is not the total focus of this bill. It's sort of a peripheral issue, but the lack of knowing where people are is a huge concern and one I think we need to address. So with that, I will close and take any questions.
Just one. I promise. All of the stuff that you want people to access, all the people you've described, is available if they go through the warrant process.
Correct.
Okay, so what we're doing is just avoiding the warrant process for
We're,
whatever reason.
we're trying to make it quicker in the interest of public safety.
Okay, I get it. I do not see any other questions. So I guess
Okay.
that's it. We'll
Thank
close
you.
our hearing on 10:10.
It's still early. I mean,
Compared to our track record, I would agree.